you can tell me about your work on reparations, like, yeah, your own kind of context of the work that you do to progress towards it.
So I think, firstly, I come from a very Pan-African, feminist and decolonial framing and school of thought. And I think for me, for a very long time, despite working at a grassroots level in country, the practices, the ways of working have always been at a level of acknowledging that there is a lot of historical intergenerational harm, inequity and injustice that has been perpetuated. And I think there have been small trinkets or small moments, particularly with donor and NGO relationships, or for example, in side events and advocacy moments, or in tax justice work, where it's been a lot more calling out than calling in terms of acknowledging that the harm was done. And I think just in practice, it has always been underpinned by something that was tangible in terms of the language and, one would say the tools of the master. So whatever it is, in that moment, whether it's in the context of an M&E framework, whether it's in the context of an advocacy campaign, or even if it's through consulting work, working with different funders, like I was in the context of the UK Shift the Power Funders Collective. And I think for me, it's always been underpinned by practicing what I preach. And in instances of calling in, which have been, I think, far and few in between, it's been recognizing that there is a lot of intellectual labor that goes into calling out. And I think it can be quite frustrating to a certain extent. And so I think it's about recognizing that, yes, there is a need for reparations, and that reparations can take shape in different forms. And I think maybe what we've seen in the context of reparations, particularly in the most documented experiences, for example, in the US, where there've been legal petitions, where there've been petitions before elected leaders, in councils or state level, I think those probably have been the most progressive forms of reparations advocacy. And I think for me, what is beautiful about that is that at least we're able to learn from that, even though we don't necessarily see as many successes in that context. I mean, the one that's closest to me based in Botswana is in Namibia, where, the German government basically acknowledged harm and so forth. And then they packaged, whatever compensation that they feel like it was, in the context of a development,
Closest examples to you.
Yeah. And basically, at the end of the day, that was really more materially, gaslighting, and not necessarily, and packaging it in the form of, development and not necessarily reparations in itself. And so I think for me, it's really about the work of reshaping language, the work of continuously calling out, whether it's within the context of tax justice, it's in the context of advocacy, or, even in just some of the tools that are used whenever there is any policy public discourse that would be around sanctions, state debt, or even economic growth. And so I think for me, it's very important to always have that grassroots perspective. It's always important to have a certain lens around intersectionality, because reparations can look very different for different communities. And also recognizing that a nation state might just have also its own different form of reparations. And so I think for me, it's quite broad, but it's still just acknowledging that it is underpinned by praxis, underpinned by lived experiences. And really, for me, it's about being able to tangibly see the difference, because the conditions in which colonialism, the conditions in which extraction and exploitation have occurred have been very tangible and have been very material. And so when we're speaking about reparations, the same should be in the context of whatever should be returning and whatever should be compensated for in the context of loss and damage.
And do you have views about like what would be the conditions that would mean that repair has been met? Like, yeah. What would repair or reparations look like, respecting exactly that, the fact that it means it's been experienced, the harm has been experienced in different ways for different communities and is still being experienced, right, in the context of the ongoing issues that we see. So what, therefore, where does the untangling of what repair for harm could look like begin for you?
So I think for me, first, it starts with language. It starts with truth, right? It starts with acknowledging that there is injustices in the past. And we've seen, elements of that, but I think the full breadth and depth of it, hasn't been seen. I recall someone talking about how you can see with the, shark ecosystem and some of their migration patterns literally resembling the Atlantic slave trade. And so I think for me, first, it really starts with the fact that we're in a capitalist system. And so it means money, tangible means, right? That's the first thing. And in a way that is pegged against any currency fluctuations or currency deviations, because I think we haven't always factored that in. I think in many instances, whenever someone has a historical lens, it's always about inflation. But I think for me, it's also just looking at that, the purchase power parity of a nation state. And a second level, I think it's acknowledging that there's been a lot of capital flight, even post-independence dispensation for so many countries. And so how do you then make sure that there's some form of redress in the context of that capital flight? What does it mean for a country's reserves to be, for example, housed in a different nation state when you're looking at Francophone African states? And so that means obviously recalibrating that system. It means essentially targeting the structural, legal, and social capital that exists, in terms of who occupies some of the governance mechanisms in multilateral institutions, who occupies or rather drives the design, the implementation, the review of multilateral agreements or bilateral agreements between states, those that govern trade, those that govern, what kind of infrastructure will be developed in the context of sustainable development. What does it mean socially in the context of acknowledging and affirming indigenous peoples? Botswana heralded in a new government on the 30th of October. And I think one way of atoning was effectively having a burial for a man who spent 3 years, a man whose corpse spent 3 years at a mortuary, and acknowledging that the government is able to use state machinery and have literally everyone mobilized, where the head of state is actually able to bury and literally take a shovel and help bury this man in his ancestral land, I think for me is one powerful way of acknowledging social capital. And so if that redress can be taken up as a result of political will, and I think that will be a start, because essentially that political will not be tainted with corruption. That political will will recognize the historical legacies of what it means to return certain things that are key to our history, particularly in the way that we documented our history, in artifacts, in history, in memorabilia, even in our natural resources. And so I think for me, there's so many different facets in acknowledging that capital and making sure that it's underpinned to carry the same value in which it had when it was extracted and exploited, and extrapolated to the current day's value in a way that not only means that there's some form of equity in the context of trade, or a country's balance sheet when needing to pay certain imports, but also in recognizing just some of the social elements. What does it mean in the context of being able, or inter-regional travel? What does it mean in the context of being able to then actually make certain voting decisions at multilateral institutions in an era where there's certain countries that have veto power?
So the fluidity of the different issues, where you're giving like insights to different aspects of the ongoing mechanisms around our economic lives, around our economic governance that have ongoing coloniality. Do you feel that reparations starts with integrating the concepts into those spaces, or seeing their dismantling? Or I guess it doesn't, in many ways it doesn't need to be an either or, but I guess where are the fundamental blocks? What's realistic, what's practical? Where would you see like the road towards reparations being actualized, or is it in the more legal sense of starting processes that document harm, that listen to harmed, afflicted groups? Because there's so many people looking at it from different perspectives. as well.
I mean, on one end, in terms of trying to be pragmatic, it's recognizing that there are certain systems, the financial architecture, the policy-making architecture, the geopolitic that's currently dominating is really quite deeply seated, embedded in the fabric of our global society. And so I think from one end, it's sitting there and saying, but where are some of those levers and where there's some of those tools? For example, if we had a little bit more imagination, the Summit of the Future could have been something that would have recognized reparations and not necessarily restricted to what is, I think, business as usual. And I think, there's certain tools that we're able to then deploy as a result of that historical legacy where we say, okay, let us address some of these issues. So if you look at, for example, global health, what did the COVID-19 pandemic teach us? That some countries can exercise some element of solidarity, even though there was a certain border that couldn't be crossed around intellectual property and generic manufacturing for vaccines. But the reality was that at least there was recognizing that we need certain funding flows for COVID-19 hard lockdowns or other interventions to prevent or mitigate the spread. We need certain instruments like states of emergency to be deployed so that resources can be allocated, and also some state infrastructure and essentially state infrastructure around pandemic or disaster situations can be deployed to ensure that lives aren't lost. And then there's a more radical way, and I think that's where the decolonial framing comes in, because decolonial, and I think you can't have there's two practices to this. There's recognizing that there's a non-violent element, which often is widely preached, that everyone sort of speaks about, and everyone appreciates and acknowledges. And I think that there's quite a lot of readily available evidence on that. However, if we look at the violent element, it's recognizing that you do need to deconstruct, because what was built off of violence can only ever, it won't be relinquished, it won't be transferred. The reality is that violence begets violence. And so how then do you get an anti-colonial praxis, ecosystem, culture, form of redress across the spectrum? It's quite evidently clear that it is through violence. Even though there's certain problematic examples of it that essentially are genocide, I think the reality is that we have now seen how, even when we're talking about international law, it's international law for a certain demographic that's based on a hierarchy, that's based on skin color, that's based on a certain perception of supremacy. And so from the pragmatic lens, we're seeing that there's certain limitations. From this other element of non-violent decolonial framing, we're recognizing that there are barriers. There are barriers because how do you then, for example, ensure capital transfer, if not capital flight, to communities and the most disadvantaged, in an imperial state? How do you ensure? We've seen protest action. We've seen so many different forms that have been trying to challenge it. There's been so much intellectual thought over centuries that has been exploring this. But the reality is that the fact that there is no military backing means that that progress will be limited. And so it's recognizing that a decolonial framing will, to an extent, require violence. And I think so many civil rights leaders, so many activists have acknowledged this, because ultimately, even when you're not doing anything, you are still a threat to that element of supremacy, right? And so how do you then acknowledge it, and what is the only threat that can be there? And I think it's also evidenced in phobia. Whatever anti-LGBT framing, whatever anti-phobia that's spread across, it's a fear, but still people are carrying out hate crimes, people are carrying out corrective rape, people are carrying out violent crimes against these communities who they so-called fear. And so I think for me, it's just recognizing that, perpetrators, colonial masters, imperialist enablers can only ever be dealt with through violence, because they are ultimately by design, by their nature, violent. Poverty is deeply violent. How do you then counteract that? It's obviously going against the neoliberal framework towards a socialist state with certain interventions that don't pay attention to the economic metrics that are used today. Those economic metrics that tend to exclude communities, especially those who are living in the margins, who don't conform to the averages and the statistics and the country rating frameworks.
Wow. I think the distinction you've drawn between what non-violent and violent decolonial pathways could mean and the implications of that. And the thing is, we know that it's more insidious now. The economic coloniality is like so hardwired in, and it's almost like the legal mechanisms. Even back then, you could insure for the loss of a person that you had enslaved, losing them. You could insure against that loss. So even then, you had like compensatory mechanisms to ensure your capital accumulation from this this kind of exploitation. Now it's even more obscure the way that it's cemented. So I do think that thing of like fighting it through legal means, it's just not, there's not much there. That it's like a very
sophisticated. It's a lot more sophisticated. It evolves. The more that we challenge privilege, power, and patriarchy, the more that they evolve, the more that they adapt, right? And that, I guess, that is part of the human evolution. And so how then do we, how do we stunt that evolution? How do we stop that, in lieu of nurturing, in lieu of love work, in lieu of regenerative systems, in lieu of nature in itself, because it is self-healing, and I think for me, as you were just sharing, I'm thinking about, mutually assured destruction, which is basically the cornerstone of the global geopolitic, because that is literally the only thing that's stopping us from having another world war. That is literally the only thing that's stopping, other states from actually deploying the resources that is going towards military investments, towards their own universal health coverage, towards social protections, towards, eliminating houselessness. And so I think there's a certain element where we need to recognize these truths, is that it's really about mutually assured destruction. And so if we're to end up eliminating the need for a militarist state, what does that then look like? I mean, on one end, yes, it's peace, but is peace the absence of war? No, because there are structural inequities. And this is why it's very important for it to be a layered conversation, because you can't have only one element without factoring in so many of these others. In as much as you can sit and say, oh, it's a sovereign state. A sovereign state doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? And so these are all sort of interplays that I think have merged across industrial revolutions. And I think we're yet to really see or get a reckoning where people then realize and harness their own power in the context of economic participation, in the context of even serving in the military, and recognizing that maybe my body, my psyche, my relinquishing of certain rights to serve a militarist state might then mean that I am literally perpetuating or contributing towards defacing humanity. I'm contributing towards property rights. I'm contributing towards sovereign state and not people. Because people are essentially the migrants. People are essentially the stateless people. People are essentially those who are identified by the very state that funds, fuels, and as a virtue of self-preservation, propels mutually assured destruction.
So it can't be ever in the way that we are conceiving, like reparations gives us a diagnostic to like the structures of the world, the embedded injustices, and the embedded way in which this inequality machine will keep reproducing inequality, and in a way just like cementing it, segmenting it, I don't know, just like securing it very firmly into like the next iteration of capitalist extractivism. So I do feel like from the examples that have been gathered through the mapping work that I've been doing, the understanding of like how many different forms, processes, forms, and ideas and values that underpin reparations in the widest breadth of sense is needed. I guess like some of the ways in which like I see debates reaching a kind of almost impasse is where it gets to that kind of like, what do you do with it? Do you fight within the structure? Like, so there's like some data that I've been analyzing this weekend, and it was like on reform within the system or revolution. and, you know, what would be revolutionary acts. And there was like a discussion between two people that I had brought to the focus group, and they were saying, well, you know, obviously anyone who has stood up to imperialist powers has been assassinated, has been disposed, has been like violently just murdered by the CIA and other forces. So when we talk about like reparations only being achieved through social revolution, that's also like, you know, gets us into kind of, you know, aspects of like understanding historically what's happened to figures, to people who have stood up. So I guess, yeah, it's like kind of understanding why we still have an urgency to these issues, and it's still not going to be just all through like mechanistic approaches of like, you know, working out what compensation amounts are as well. I guess it's more of a reflection that's revealing itself to me as the more the data builds in a way.
And if I can color that, I think, you know, it's important to recognize that, again, it's limited to social order, right? It's literally recalibrating the social order. And it's literally sitting there and saying that in as much as they are, you know, well-behaved and law-abiding citizens, the reality is that when there's economic strife, the reality is that when there's an unsustainable, you know, cost of living that they need to navigate and grapple with, the reality is that, you know, people are going to revolt. And so when you look at the more recent, for example, you know, fees must fall in South Africa, yes, there were certain wins that were made. But if you look at just some of these numbers that are coming now, more than a decade later, where, you know, universities are still very capitalist, even though they're getting certain government subventions, you know, and these are private universities, mind you, where you're finding, for example, with the Kenyan protests against, you know, the finance bill and against, you know, some of, you know, the things that were being decided on, the reality is that then there is the element of violence coming out with abducting people and, you know, disappearing them, and then all of a sudden their families having to grieve, you know, their loved ones because they come back, unfortunately, you know, without life form. And so I think, you know, it's just looking at, you know, even when you're looking at some of the deaths that happened at Lekki Gate, when you're looking at Nigeria and the end SSMPA or the end SARS movements against the military intelligence services, I think for me, it's so telling, because at the end of the day, you know, you want this revolution to happen and you want this revolution to thrive, but what is happening in the discord between negotiations and mediation, and wherever military ends up backing, you know, the populace. You know, we're seeing it with Sudan, you know, where there was a beautiful revolution that occurred, you know, and, you know, the ending of, you know, 2 decades of war, and now essentially now people are back at war, and you know, you're trying to figure out and trying to grapple with what is happening, you know, when there's now civil conflict. And we're acknowledging that, yes, there might be certain intelligence elements or imperial elements that are influencing, but, you know, what happened to that social revolution? You know, what happened when someone burned themselves in front of a government office in Tunisia and the Arab Spring, you know, literally came? You know, how come the material conditions have not actually changed despite people power being exercised, despite there being that social change? Because once you get that culture, and we're seeing it, you know, we had our own new president who's a human rights lawyer sit and say, you know, he appreciates and wants an enraged citizenry, because we were a somewhat covert intelligence state where we were not allowed to exercise the freedom of association and assembly. We're not allowed to protest. And so I think it's very telling that now, in the context of people realizing, oh, it is possible to take action, and they're emboldened to take action, they do. And unfortunately now, you're finding that there's a certain level beyond whatever mediation, beyond whatever intervention, beyond whatever win that there might be socially, right? Maybe it wasn't necessarily, you know, a state meting out violence or deploying the army, but, you know, maybe it's just certain concessions around what were demands, citizen demands. But the reality is that in between that mediation, in between that transition, you're then getting to a point where the liberation isn't fulfilling because the material conditions are not there. And that's why you see why the economic element is so important. And I see this even with the military coups that occurred in West Africa, where, so many, there's a lot of people power, that's backing the fact that there was a military coup. There's a lot of, people power that's affirmed by some of the decolonial, I guess, maybe signs, in terms of, removing French military, in terms of even just the language that the heads of state, are using. And I think for me, it's sitting there and saying, but how come these states like Mali, Burkina Faso, have now essentially, enacted anti-LGBT laws? How come when someone has lived all their life, even if it was under a dictatorship or under brutal governance shortcomings, that they were able to live and thrive, and now all of a sudden, because they're under a military leader, they all of a sudden have to, conform legislatively? And for me, that is a backsliding of human rights. And when I look at, for example, military leaders such as Uganda, where there's already an anti-LGBT law, and where there's so many young people that have lived basically under one head of state, how is that any different, right? How is that any different, for example, with Rwanda, similarly, which also has a former, military leader as a head of state. And, apparently this people power is there and consistently calling for the same leadership to continue. The material conditions of people under Gaddafi in Libya, were far much better than now in the advent of democracy, right? Our,
he stood up.
Literally. Yeah, literally.
Celebrated by Obama and Clinton.
Yeah. So it's very telling, even my own country, which is considered a beacon or an example of natural resource management coming out of independence, had a military leader for a head of state. And that was one of the most scary times for citizens, for journalists, where sedition laws were used against them. And so I think it's then recognizing, in as much as they can be that social upliftment, they can be that social revolution, they can be people power, the reality is that if you're not holding capital, if you're not holding the kind of capital that can be deployed to back resources for meaningful interventions, change, and upliftment of a people, then you've got a long way to go. If you're not carrying, for example, the obedience of the military, you've got a long way to go. If you're not carrying the power that comes with the rule of law in the form of ruling or governing a nation state, or adjudicating as a check and balance, then you've got a long way to go. So I think it's just recognizing that there is a need to extend beyond social elements. And I think one avenue of that is through political participation. What does it mean when we get radical activists in political spaces? In as much as the tools of the master will not get us there, at least that's one avenue that we can start exploring, occupying, and fulfilling in a way to counter some of these regressions that we're seeing, whether it's in a thriving democracy like my country, or whether it's in a questionable one like Rwanda and Uganda, or whether it's in a military state like some West African countries like Mali and Burkina Faso.
So I guess your participation in politics is that is your example of, in practice, your commitment to seeing repair approaches, seeing explicit anti-colonial approaches through being able to participate in politics, seek political opportunities to be a strong advocate, a thorn in the side, I guess, as well.
I mean, on one end, representation matters and representation counts. How meaningful that is literally questioning it. And that's why there's a need to take activism to the ballot. That's why there's a need to then literally use some of the instruments to question, prod, and have the legitimacy of the state. Because when you're serving as an elected leader, you're not only backed by people, but there's state machinery and infrastructure. And so that already in itself is an affirmation of certain ideals, values, and a social contract with the people, in that someone who actually occupies the state. And I think for me, in being independent, so not being part of a political ideology or party is essentially that, is essentially questioning the political establishment and actually showcasing another example of what activism can look like in the context of political participation. And I say this because so much human rights work as a result of resourcing, again, resourcing, is as a result of it being apolitical. So you're resourced and you're funded in your social change work, in your impact, your change making, because it's considered apolitical. But how is that any different to the economic agents that deploy lobbying? How is that any different from any other industry that would like certain provisions or certain mechanisms or interventions from the state so that it can benefit them? We currently have a new government that has, committed to the equivalent of just under $380 per month as a minimum wage. That's almost double, if I'm not mistaken, of the minimum wage that is currently now in place from the previous government. And I think for me, you are seeing all the different classes coming and arguing. The working middle class sitting and questioning why should those, get such a high amount, right? You're getting the other individuals that are sitting and questioning, but what's the point? Because our labor is more valued compared to yours. We get more stress, and so forth. There's just so many different elements that are coming up. And I think for me, it's really reflective in that you then need to, even in the social movements, you're still leaving other communities behind because they don't acknowledge and recognize the intergenerational harm. They don't acknowledge and recognize the fact that they're also othered. They're also in the margins because they're not part of the elites. And I'm talking from a context where we're in one of the top 5 countries of high inequality in the context of GNI. And so that already tells you that the wealth is concentrated in a few people. And so I think for me, it's very important just sort of recognizing the multi-layers and that they're very different angles. And when we speak about the need for that truth, when you look at the Yogyarta principles, they've got one that speaks to the right to truth. And when you talk about the right to truth, you're recognizing that we need to acknowledge all these different facets. You need to acknowledge that, for example, there was a debate in South Africa where they were saying teachers should earn the same as doctors. And there was a whole lot of pushback. And so even in that context, what are you saying about those that care for your children, that raise your children for a minimum of 5 to 8 hours a day? Are they not deserving for that compensation in helping develop and grow your child? And so I think these are just so many different facets where we're literally barriers to our own liberation.
Yeah, exactly. So your fluency across diagnosing the kind of root causes of inequality in our society and understanding what can be done in different settings is so powerful hearing you. I'm really struck by this idea of the way that you presented social revolution, potential kind of steps towards social revolution, what that means in terms of alliances or whatever kind of this different contextual kind of scenario of military support or military disdainment, military kind of autonomy and extremism. But I guess also hearing you speak about this means nothing without some economic measures that are really structural, and I'm guessing you mean there dismantling elite wealth that has been captured through theft, through the stolen resources that have been part of what slavery and the colonial period represent. But alongside that, you're also talking about political participation as a strong mode of kind of inputting into the fabric that holds that inequality as in its unjust forms at the moment, right? So do you feel that these multi-layered kind of approaches, this is the ways in which we weave them? We don't just rely on one or the other, but we try and seek to connect our spaces where we're working across these trying to get economic structural reforms, trying to get political participation in ways that really address and challenge and then provoke introspection, but provoke it in a way that's we don't want just marginal change. We don't want a small tinkering of wording on a legislation, but at the same time keeping that idea that most change has happened in societal periods of this big historical change. It has come from social revolution. It has come from our bodies being sacrificed as well. So I guess, yeah, it's not, is your kind of idea that we work towards all these aspects, but we connect where we can as well, because the separation of our causes is really like fundamentally, you know, how politicians talk this down, right? They regularly dismiss reparations as not really a big thing.
Yeah. And I mean, when you look at, you know, separation being the operative word, you know, one of the biggest things for any ruler or tyrant or authoritarian is divide and conquer, right? And so if you're able to do that across class, if you're able to do that across skin color, if you're able to do that across socialization, if I put it that way, in terms of attributes that people don't have control over, I think you obviously will win, right? And that's how patriarchy, privilege, power, supremacy are perpetuated. And so I think, you know, as you were sharing, I was thinking about how, you know, when you can acknowledge truth, you're able to navigate from wherever you are within the constellation, right? And so one of the beauties, I think, about climate justice work is that a lot of climate activists, and I'm very intentional, not being environmental, not being, you know, land degradation, not being, you know, loss and damage, in climate justice activists that will have a starting point on intergenerational harm, that will have a starting point around the praxis of indigenous knowledge, systems, people, and collectives, and history. I think for me, is one of the easiest, almost salient entry points for anyone to be radicalized. And I say that because there's such a huge ecosystem and there's so many different vast topics to be covering, just from ecological, just from a environmental perspective. And then never mind when you're talking about you know, man-made disasters, never mind when you're talking about, you know, acts of God, as insurance companies put it. But also just recognizing that there's so many other different elements and layers that climate justice activists are able to speak to, and that they have the legitimacy that comes with a knowledge system that propels science, right? That a knowledge system that essentially was, you know, one would say, a remnant or a foundation for knowledge, right? Science in itself. And so you're finding that the science, academia, you know, there are multilateral technical partnerships, and there's significant resources that has been plowed into climate-related work, inclusive of those that is problematic, as with the Bezos Fund. But however, you're just recognizing that so many countries, states, scientists, physicians have recognized the role of climate, and they've invested and plowed into it in the context of ODA funding, in the context of, you know, bilateral funding, and even embedded it within change. And I say that because it is significantly different from gender-related investments. It is significantly different in terms of, when you see the infrastructure, the built environment, and the kinds of investments that are going into it, the kinds of investments that are going into COPs. You know, how many delegations are going to these different COPs? How many different climate mechanisms exist in comparison to, for example, gender mainstreaming, gender equality, or gender equity? And you know, I say this because, yes, there's a huge history behind it, but I don't think it's any different from, for example, the peace and security industry or sector, because peace activists have been there time memorial, even amidst the first two world wars, you know? And I think for me, the fact that peace architecture holds so much more prominence in the form of security councils, in the form of military, you know, observers or peacekeepers, is already quite a sign to sit and say, it's very clear that to get so much progress, you do need that political element to be a factor. You do need financial architecture. You do need a certain interest that needs to be protected in the form of property rights, in the form of trade agreements, in the form of, you know, previously historically owned, you know, through colonization assets. And so I think for me, that's very important. And why? Because historically, when you look at care work, it has significantly been neglected. It has been seen as to not have value. It has been seen to only be limited towards a household. However, when we're looking at economic indicators, a country's health, fiscal health, can also be linked to an individual household indebtedness, right? You can literally peg the minimum wage against, for example, a domestic worker. You can literally peg a quantification of sex work. You can literally peg the quantification of counseling services. And so why is it that those things that are of community, that are nurturing, that are healing, that are of self-preservation, because communities cannot connect without a sense of belonging and becoming, without any of those elements, without values, without the spirit of ubuntu that is distinct to the African context? Why is it that these very key fundamental, not only social, meta, structural, spiritual elements are not deemed to have value? Yet, when we look at many spaces of spiritual refuge, when you look at churches, for example, Catholic Church, I haven't been to a country where the Catholic Church does not own multiple or acres of land. And so for me, it's recognizing that what we were dispossessed of was essentially valued by certain quarters. And so even if you're to sit and say, we want reparations, bring back our assets, there is still a high likelihood, as a result of the knowledge architecture, the financial architecture, that those things will be devalued because of who owns them. Why is it that market performers are significantly, why is there a market run just because a certain investor that might be more prominent has bought certain shares in a company? So I think, the fact that value is often perceived from a white lens, a white gaze, from the hierarchy of white supremacy, and anything that isn't a remnant of that is of no value, is where we definitely need to start recognizing that all of us have a role to play, regardless of what form of activism, regardless of what form of intellectual thought, whether it's through lived experiences or established theory, knowledge challenging and critiquing in the form of academic studying, or it's in publishing. And so the reality is that everyone has a role to play, but I think what is universal is the truth. You might have phenomena, you might have very different experiences, even if it's one, scenario. But an injustice is an injustice. A tear is a tear. The spilling of blood is the spilling of blood. And that is the brutal truth. Enslaved people were enslaved. That is the brutal truth. And if we start from a space of truth, we're then acknowledging and opening up that space for healing. We're opening up that space for reconciliation. We're opening up that space for people to recognize and at least have some ounce of shame with the wealth that has been hoarded by the generations that preceded them.
So actually the societal processes for centering our truth, our historical injustices, the truth that underpins that recognition, that's really where an honest and authentic process towards reparations happens, right? And do you feel like actually the contributions we can make are in, or maybe even just determining what our own processes of like how we want reparations to look like could be, like not waiting for it to be determined by international human rights law, or like a state deciding to show some compassion, which is usually politically driven, to like, okay, now we'll have an inquiry or we'll have a process, like almost like taking the process, taking sovereignty over what people want as their own processes, like, like victim-led rather than perpetrator-led. And that's been a real theme that's come up, like the only reparations that is authentic is victim-led, and therefore it starts with like people defining their own processes and almost like what would be a supranational process towards reparations, given all of this wasn't just neatly contained in states, and the maps were already distorted by what the colonizers did, but to like try and seek redress on these current maps is also inauthentic in a way as well.
I mean, you're reminding me of a saying, eat the rich, and a lot of people have literally done that with some revolutions, right, where we've seen them eat the rich. And so I think for me, it's, when you're talking about, for example, survivor-led processes and what that meant. I'm thinking about, for example, apartheid in South Africa and how, Truth and Reconciliation Commission had to be carried out. And I mean, that provided some form of healing, that provided some form of consolation, without necessarily the economic and other elements. And then, when I think about, for example, even with Rwanda and how a nation state was able to then move on as a result of acknowledging that, everyone has been a perpetrator, everyone played a role, but also there's a need for everyone to be able to reconcile and try live in harmony. And I think embed and, instill certain social interventions that can hopefully build the identity of a nation state. And I think for me, it's then, it can take shape in variant ways. I think firstly, the conversation around remittances is not acceptable at all, because that's essentially care work. That's essentially, families taking care of their own in lieu of the state, ensuring service delivery. And as much as people feel like, oh no, that means if there's certain grants that come and flow to myself, that means that we're just going to take the resources and move away. What does that essentially mean? I'm reminded by a conversation that we're facilitating in Tanzania when I asked, is a solution for a survivor of sexual assault essentially someone getting hanged, or essentially someone getting some form of violence in the form of mob justice, because communities in many instances carry out mob justice when the state has failed them. And it was very difficult for the men in the room to hold that thought and to recognize and grapple with it. It was it wasn't easy. And however, quite a few feminists were like, but for me, this is one, tangible. This is one positive. I feel like I will feel better. I feel like that is a starting point to my healing. And, so I think for me as a survivor, it's also about sitting there and trying to figure out, does this bring back my humanity, the very dignity and personhood that was stripped away from me when I was violated? Or does it make me out to be the perpetrator? Which then brings back that very conversation around decolonial framing and violence. What does it then mean in that context? And I think these are issues that are complex that we need to grapple with and reckon. And that also, that really does come with the conversation that is the brutal truth, and uncomfortable truth, and ugly truth. I think these terms existed for a reason. And so this is why for me, it's about sitting and being open to literally exploring what would justice look like for me, and acknowledging that justice is not reparations. So even if that that atrocity was to happen to a perpetrator, what does that then mean in bringing back my humanity that was taken away? And what would that look like? That can be very, very different from a legal question or social inquiry, right? Because social, I think there must be some interpersonal relationships. I think there must be some engagement with community if you're being social. But what does it mean as an individual, which then is, I think, parallel to the concept of individual rights. And I think this is why, the legal economic systems have thrived so much, because in as much as we can be social, and in as much as we perform, participate, and can uphold certain social norms, we are still individuals, and deep individuals that will sit with certain truths where maybe we can't publicly say those things, where maybe because of it's not normal to be violent, I can't sit and say, this is my revenge, right? And so I think maybe that's why this individualistic system has thrived. But I think, when you're looking at, for example, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which is the only legal instrument, the only binding instrument that speaks to people's rights, I think that's also a bit of a starting point, where that inquiry into the value of ubuntu, I am because you are. We have a saying in Setswana, in my country, where you say, "Motho ke motho ka batho," someone is a person or a being as a result of others. So am I truly living if I'm in a vacuum? Am I truly living if I don't perform, participate in social structures and means of participation? And so, yes, it's a very deeply personal and I guess philosophical question and inquiry that we definitely need to not only face ourselves, but also hopefully that people also do that kind of work. They do the kind of work that can withstand the performance of emotional intelligence, the kind of work that can recognize, okay, if I am a beneficiary of exploitation, extraction of natural resources, of labor, of the spilling of blood and the sweating of a whole generation of people, what is my reconciliation with the reality of benefiting from owning that historical legacy? If I can own the capital, if I can own the asset and the property, why can I not own the social ramifications of it? Why can I not own the spiritual legacy of it? Because ultimately, if I'm still benefiting from the material assets and property, surely I should be able to recognize that there must be some way that I can give back. There must be some way that I can relinquish. And ideally, if we were in a state that was regenerative, that was circular, then no one would be without. Because the fear of being without community, the fear of being without the skin color that protects you, the fear of being without the patriarchy that you benefit from, ideally, that means everyone can live in harmony. That means you're essentially having Ubuntu realized, because your success, your existence, your health is underpinned by someone else's.
And I think this plays out at so many different like levels as well, that your existence is related to my, like your, you know, even like the idea that you can have like reparations payments in the US, you can see, you know, say they got achieved and say median wealth was like improved, and there was, you know, the proposal that's like, you know, been kind of debated in the American context, that happened, that's still going to have a huge distorting effect for global South communities, because it's going to contribute more to boom and bust kind of cycles, and it's going to strengthen the US dollar, and it's going to have interest rate ramifications. So when you play out like my justice at the expense of what, that's when I think like the idea that like reparations is just in one context starts to unravel, because this is a global justice kind of paradigm. And that's why, again, I think that that's part of why it comes back to like it's so easy to dismiss it.
And I think you just reminded me of something, because I think we're seeing it play out now, especially post Trump's election. And I think for me, it's very important for us to decenter US elections, the US empire, even if it might be difficult. But we're seeing it with gentrification. We're seeing people going and living in other countries in the global majority and essentially hiking up all those prices and doing, you know, literally having the same kind of impact that's happening in the US. And so I think that's a very, very important conversation, because you know, injustice somewhere is injustice everywhere. And so the reality is that if you do get reparations in that context, you need to acknowledge reparations in so many other contexts, right? And so maybe that's where the fear is. That's where the danger is. And yeah, so there's a lot to unpack, but